Welcome to the Breaking Up with Naive podcast, where it's not heartbreak, it's a rebrand. I'm your host, Dr. Becky Raulerson. This is a place where my friends and I share our stories of heartbreak in life, combined with our testimonies of how being a Christ follower led us to surviving the heartbreak and to rebuilding healthy lives. While the stories shared here are relevant and true, it is important to note that I am not a trained counselor, not a trained mental health counselor, nor someone who assesses mental health. If you feel that you need help in that area, I encourage you to please seek medical guidance. The testimonies shared here on this podcast are intended to encourage and inspire other women to be less naive when it comes to Satan's ugly ways. With that, welcome to today's episode of Breaking Up with Naive. Hello, and welcome back to all of our followers. I am super excited about this being the start of season 2. So this will be our season 2, episode 1. And something that I did to take a break over the holiday season was just to take some time to reflect and to spend some time with close family members. My son was in town for a few weeks. I also went on a mission trip to Guatemala, and I will share more about that in a coming episode. But today's episode is really special for me because my son is home for a little while, and I actually asked him if he'd like to share some of his perspective of what it was like to grow up in a home with divorced parents. And while his dad and I did not divorce until he was 11, there was still a good chunk of those teenage years and of that adolescent time when he had to go back and forth to his dad's house or my house. So rather than focus on what it's like for the co-parent themselves, I thought it would be a really great perspective to just let him share about what that was like. I expect him to be really honest during this episode. He may share more than I even want him to share, but that's okay because he has his own perspective. And I hope that this will really help people in the future, especially those who might find themselves in this situation where they're going through a divorce, to really be able to keep their kids in mind. So I would like to introduce all of my listeners to my son, Zeb Raulerson. Welcome to the show today.
How's it going?
It's going good. So we went to church this morning and then are coming home to record this episode. Zeb, tell me a little bit about what your childhood was like before your dad and I divorced.
My childhood was just regular. I mean, it was just living with two parents and, whenever I'm young, there's not really like a lot of moments to where I think about a lot of things. I just have a lot of fun with whatever I'm doing, especially during the house that we lived in during the time. It had like some woods in the back, and I remember that one Christmas whenever we got like those little miniature four-wheelers, and we'd always ride them around for a long time and drive them through the woods. And then eventually you and Dad like sat us down and said that we were moving, and I was like, okay. I mean, obviously during that time I was a little bit more excited because I guess I really wanted to like go somewhere new because we've been living there for so long. And so whenever me and Carly got told that we were moving into a new house, I was excited. And I mean, other than that, it's just been a lot of different things that I did that created a lot of good memories, but a lot of those memories are very fake now, just because of how young I was.
Yeah, I do remember those four-wheelers. I remember the house that you're speaking of, and we did have a lot of fun times playing in the yard. You and your sister found a kitten one time that was way too young to be away from its mom. And you were coming in the kitchen and asking for milk, and I finally figured out what was happening, and you both were very upset with me when I made you return the kitten to its mother, which now you would definitely understand, but at the time, it didn't make sense to you all. We also had another cat that was an outside cat that we adopted for a while, and he disappeared on us and never did come back. We have no idea what happened to that cat. So we do have some fond memories there, but I know that you and I have spent a lot of time over the last several years, especially since you've been an adult, and you've been gone. You've moved and you've had some different experiences with your work. And we've had a chance to talk about what emotions you were going through whenever your dad and I separated and eventually divorced. And you've been really transparent. You've talked to me about that a lot. And there have been things that you told me that that I hurt you and that some of my choices hurt you. And we've been able to work through those and apologize and really try to keep some things in mind. But for the sake of our listeners, tell me a little bit about what you remember during that time.
Okay, so I remember the day that it happened. It was sometime during the summer of 2015. And the reason why I remembered that it was the summer of 2015 was because me and my sister were getting ready to go on our St. Augustine trip. And we were packing up, and then we were walking into the bedroom. And the one thing that I can remember is my mother being in tears, asking us to stay with her. And in my head, I was like, what's wrong with you right now? But obviously I was little, so I was, not really focused too much on it because I didn't know what was going on. The only thing in my mind was going to St. Augustine so that way I can be with my childhood friend. And then whenever Dad came over, I guess we got sent to our bedrooms or whatever. And then that's whenever the screaming started happening and the yelling. I walk out and I just seen you and Dad like screaming at each other. And I didn't really know what was going on. All I knew is that I understood the severity of how bad the situation was whenever I looked to my left and I seen Carly in tears and just started crying. And then that's whenever the blame game started happening with you blaming Dad that she started crying and Dad started blaming you for crying. And it was like, because I understood how bad the situation was, I really just wanted it to stop. And so I was trying to tell you guys to stop, but I was kind of just like not there, like screaming at you guys to stop because y'all two were just bickering back and forth with each other, not really paying attention to me. But I was a little disappointed that we didn't go to St. Augustine, but what I do remember after that is that we got into the truck, and instead of going to St. Augustine like I thought we were going to, we went back to Dad's house, and my dad was in tears because he couldn't believe what happened. And I think it was around Father's Day too, but that's not important. Other than that, it was just like kind of a new thing for me. I didn't understand what was going on, which the divorce was probably the one out of the two things that is like etched into my memory because from that moment on, that's really when like my life turned around and went downhill from there.
So we have talked about that a lot, and we've talked about how you feel like that was a pivotal moment in your life that changed everything for the negative. And obviously, now as an adult, you can look back and see that both your dad and I were also experiencing a lot of emotions and a lot of things that were happening. So after that, once we were divorced, I think your dad and I both were in dating relationships, and maybe describe some of what that felt like for you to go back and forth. And we did have 50-50, so you were with me half the time and with him half the time. But just tell me what that perspective was like from your end.
It was an adjustment because it was like now I had to live 1 week with this parent, and then the next week I had to live with this parent. But I think the only hard part about all of that was that it was me kind of trying to like move stuff from one house to the next every week, which, I mean, it's not something that I hold a grudge with. It was just something that had happened and that I had to deal with. But whenever you said that you were in dating relationships, I do remember some of the heightened emotions between you and Dad. Like, I remember whenever Dad moved into that house, that it was like you two sitting on the step, and then he was just having a chat with us, and then you were kind of just staying silent, and Dad was trying to talk to us soft, and then you were kind of having like your like an overinflated ego because I guess he had a girlfriend that we didn't know about, and so he was having a chat with us, and then you would make some like snarky comments, and then he would try to defend his position about not having a girlfriend, and then you would just continue being snarky about it. But that was one thing I remember. And then the second thing I remember was whenever we went to somebody's house, and then you dropped us off, you slammed the door at the house that we were at, and then I just seen like that F you, and then you walked away. And so I was, again, like I didn't really think of it. I just knew that it was an adjustment. As far as like you and Dad being in relationships, me and Carly figured out later on that yes, Dad was in a relationship, and you prevented us from seeing them, I guess because you weren't ready or whatever. I don't know. But I do remember like Dad having a girlfriend, but you didn't want us seeing them. And so we would just look across the yard and then out of curiosity and then see picking up her kids from school and then walk into the house or her kids were playing in the yard. And I was just confused as to why I wasn't allowed to go over there and see them if there was somebody that my dad was seeing. And then eventually you walked into the office and calmed down and apologized for everything, and then that's whenever we were able to go see him. And it was fine for the year that they were dating, only because she had kids and our parents were dating, so it was kind of like we were forced to be a part of this family. And then a year later, whenever they broke up, it was kind of like being separated from the family after they broke up. It's a lot of complicated emotions that I can't really put into words. But out of the years that you and Dad have been like in and out of relationships, I kind of just put on this face of like, all right, well, you're dating my mom, so I guess I'm a part of the family. And then whenever like y'all would break up with the person, then it's like, okay, well, now they're not important to me anymore. So it was kind of just like a lot of quick situations to where I've like tried like forcibly built a relationship and then had to cut off that relationship just because, you know, you two were dating and then y'all stopped dating. And so, yeah.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of you sharing this with me over time and over the last few years has been really heartbreaking for me because I obviously recognize mistakes that I made. Actually, your dad didn't come from a divorced family, and neither did I. So it was the first time, really, that we had to experience the emotions of this and how to deal with co parenting through it. And I know I have a very good friend, childhood friend, who did come from a divorced family. And when she realized what was happening to my marriage and that we were divorcing, one of the first things she said to me, she looked at me very directly. It was just she and I sitting there. And she said, whatever you do, do not communicate through the children to each other. And she gave me very specific examples of times that her mom and dad would tell her and her siblings to say something to the other parent because the two parents could not have a conversation with each other. And so I think that was something I was always really conscientious about because she asked me and she gave me that perspective. However, I do know that that probably still happened some. So I know you have a lot of hard feelings about those years of your life, but can you tell me anything that you think that your dad and I did right during that time and that we really did the best we could and that maybe we could have done worse, but we actually tried to do well for your sister and you?
I mean, the one thing that you guys did do well was that you tried to still provide for me and Carly because, I mean, it was kind of forced for you two to co-parent just because, obviously there was a lot of resentment between you two, but the only thing that kept y'all talking together was me and Carly. You did a pretty good job with making sure that me and Carly had the resources in order for us to succeed. Regardless, though, there was just a lot of emotional instability that was lacking between like me trying to figure out how I was going to navigate this new aspect of my life to where I'm going through these different, we're going to two different houses every week. But with that being said, I mean, that's kind of just it, is that you two did your best to make sure that me and Carly had the resources to like give us somewhat of a childhood. Like whenever Dad lost his job and he still spent his money to make sure that I had a Jeep, like obviously back then I took it for granted because I was like 16, I want a car, and I got a car. But you know, I probably didn't understand that he was struggling financially because he lost a job, but he still made the sacrifice for me to get a car anyway. So it's like things like that was good.
Okay. So, fast forward to today, you and your sister are both adults. You both live on your own and no longer live in town or live with either of us. You live on your own, working your own jobs and doing your own thing. So, where would you say your emotions and your thought process is today?
I'd say my emotion and thought process today is really good, only because out of the like whenever I was in high school, it was a big struggle because it was like out of those 4 years, it was me trying to figure out my identity and who I was. And obviously, that's really hard because I felt like I was different from everybody. I didn't care about playing football or baseball, like I didn't care about sports. Hunting and fishing was fun, but I knew that I had other interests. During that time, I played a lot of video games, and I know like playing a lot of video games, not a lot of other people do that because they'd rather just go hunting or fishing somewhere. But to me, that was my hobby, and I really enjoyed it. So out of those 4 years, I kind of just had like an identity crisis because I didn't know who I was. But now that I'm out of high school, I developed, well, I already had a developed sense of independence because me and Carly had to fend for ourselves out of those years. But just getting out kind of gave us like a bigger sense of independence as far as me going into the military and then making sure that I had a steady paycheck and figuring out lessons for myself. And then something else that happened to me recently, like a year and a half ago, that helped me straighten myself out because I realized a lot of like behavior patterns that I had to change about myself. So I kind of did like a little self-development journey, and now there's kind of like a lot of things that I value that kind of help me keep going. So to answer your question, I feel like right now I'm doing pretty good. The divorce doesn't affect me as much as it did during my teenage years, but it's still etched in my memory as like something.
Sure. And I can definitely appreciate that. We talked about this a lot. And you and your sister both handled that situation differently. The emotions of the moment didn't hit her quite as fast as it hit you, but it did hit her before she finished high school. And then I experienced a whole different thing with her than what we had co parented you through. And so you and your sister are still both very different, although, gosh, I'm so proud of you in different ways. And I know that she's very firm in her faith, and faith is something that you're still seeking in a unique way and still trying to figure out who you are as far as, you know, where you are at that. But beyond that, if you had some advice to give to maybe a couple who had kids who were 10 and 11 years old, like you and your sister were, that found themselves in a divorce situation and were going to have to co parent, what advice would you give those parents?
I would say do your best to forgive each other because the constant resentment of two parents, like the kids are going to pick up on that. And even today, I still get fed up with the resentment between my mom and my dad. It still bothers me only because it's like the child, like, eventually the child's just going to be so fed up with it where it's like, when are you two ever going to start getting along with each other? Because I feel like one of my good qualities is that to the people I care about most, I'm very loyal to them. So it kind of creates a little bit of trouble whenever you have a mom and dad that's constantly bickering at each other, and then they go to you to complain about the faults of the other parent. And then it's like, well, I don't want to hear that because that's a personal problem between you two that I just happen to be a part of. So I would say forgiveness for whatever led you to split up is the biggest thing.
So true forgiveness,
True forgiveness.
like forever forgiveness.
Like looking at each other and not seeing each other with like blame in each other's eyes, being like, well, she was the problem in my life. Somebody that you happen to have kids with. And so because you don't love each other, you still have kids that's still going to look up to you. And there's been a lot of things pretty recently that I've come to figure out, but all I can say is that as I'm figuring it out, it's quite embarrassing for me to be in the middle of all of it because it's like I look up to you and dad as my role models, but now it's like I'm here trying to diffuse this situation because, you know, like one or the other just keeps acting like a child, not really wanting to solve the problem.
Yeah, and you've said to me, and you said this more than once, that when you do come home on leave, sometimes you don't want to come home. Like you'd almost rather take your leave and go somewhere else because you kind of know what's waiting here for you as far as that's concerned. And when you're not here, there's very little communication between your two parents because there doesn't need to be any communication between the two parents. So I know that's a struggle for you. What advice would you have to young people? And I don't know that many teenagers specifically listen to this podcast, which is fine. But if you were going to give advice to teenagers who were living between divorced parents, what advice would you have for them?
Like teenagers specifically, or like,
Well, children, teenagers, somebody who's still living at home and isn't an adult yet and has divorced parents.
well, I would say as a teenager, it is difficult just because you're still treated like a child and everybody expects you to act like an adult. So it's hard for you to kind of find that middle ground. With that being said, though, whatever happens between your parents is strictly between your parents. Like, don't blame yourself to be the reason why they split up. The one thing that I would say, if you do have divorced parents, is just to continue living your life. I mean, it's your life for a reason. You make the choices that you decide to make, and look at what your parents made mistakes in during their marriage, and then tell yourself, okay, I'm not going to make that mistake whenever I have my own family one day.
And we've discussed this a lot too, that we all have mistakes because we're human and all humans make mistakes. So, I know you and I have talked about while you may not make the same mistakes your dad or I did, that there's probably going to be mistakes in your future. And so being able to handle those to the best of your ability and reflect and to attempt to not make them again is important, right?
Well, so yeah, the mistakes are one thing. Obviously, mistakes happen in the first place, so that way they tell you that, like, okay, that's probably something that I shouldn't do again. But then also take into account your parents' strengths and weaknesses. So, like, some strengths that I see out of my mother is that she's kind-hearted, she means well, she treats, like, she has a good heart, and she really cares for people in kind of like a unique way. I like to make fun of her for it, but I know, like, deep down I can kind of see, like, I like to think that I'm a good person, but in my own way, and I give my mother for that. But then my mother also has some weaknesses, in which I told her that, and I'm not going to make fun of her on her own podcast about it, but yeah, definitely do, like, just be very observant about your parents and figure out their strengths and weaknesses. so that way you can acknowledge them and then be like, I'm not go like, okay, I can see what he's doing and I'm going to see if I can fix that.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's a good perspective. So I just appreciate you always being willing to talk to me. I feel like you've done a good job of telling me what my weaknesses are as well. And that's okay because I needed to hear them. And I think my goal, even with you being an adult and your sister being an adult now, is to try to do the best I can to correct those things or to make myself stronger in the areas that are my weaknesses to make life easier for you and your sister going forward. Because I know, hopefully, Lord willing, there will be some more really big moments in your life that we're all going to want to celebrate with you and celebrate for you together. So I think that's going to be important. Any last minute words for our listeners? Just again, the goal here was just to be really transparent and share the perspective of someone who grew up in a unique divorce situation. I do think it's important to note that every single divorce situation is different. While they oftentimes have similarities and things may look alike, there's also a lot of things that are different from household to household. And so I think it's really hard to make a comparison and say that every single situation is a carbon copy of each other, because I think we all know that's not true. But in your situation, any final thoughts that you want to leave the listeners with?
I don't really have a lot of comments, or if you have divorced parents and you're struggling emotionally to kind of process the situation and you're kind of in a tight spot to where like you don't really know how to deal with it, it's okay. And it's okay in the sense of like I'm very strong in my belief about doing things your own way because everybody is unique and everybody is different. And no matter how many times my mom tries to tell me that my life would be a little bit more fixed if I just continued believing in God, which I'm sure it's true, but at the end of the day, like, to a degree, religion can play a role into it, but then you also have to figure things out for yourself and you have to learn those lessons and learn how to live your life without your parents splitting up being the reason of why your life is so miserable.
So, what I hear you saying is don't use your parents' divorce as an excuse for all the bad things that happen in your life.
Well, mainly it's just because your parents are divorced doesn't mean that you have a life that you want to live. There's a lot of things that they probably want you to do, but their opinion doesn't really matter because the only thing that matters is what you want to do. And I mean it like
But having said that, you don't mean disrespect your parents. You mean you're an adult, you can still be respectful, but then you make your own choices.
you can make your own choices. And I mean, I do my best not to disrespect my parents, but even my parents have faults that I can't really stand but to argue with them just because,
I might have been the brunt of that argument a time or two,
yes.
but I think that's normal. I think that's normal because I think it's good, even if in that moment that we're having a heated conversation or an argument, as you say, I still think that we're connecting and communicating with each other. And I'd rather you communicate with me, tell me how you're feeling, and be able to continue to go forward than to ever lose a relationship with you.
Well, I'm sure, like, looking from the parents' point of view, you would never want to lose the bond that you would have with your kids. But at the same time, if your kids have a problem with you and you're refusing to change a certain aspect about yourself to the point to where they end up cutting you off, then I mean, you can do one of two things. You can acknowledge that it probably isn't the best quality and that you would hopefully have the ambition to work on it, or you could just maintain your pride and be like, well, that's not something that I see as a problem, so it's not going to be a problem. And then you ended up costing the relationship of your child, and then you still don't do anything about it.
Yeah, so based off of those conversations that you and I have had, my best advice, and again, I want to give the disclaimer that I am not a licensed therapist. I am not a licensed counselor. I'm not that kind of podcast host, but I will say, just based off of my own experiences, my best advice is just to listen to your kids when they are willing to communicate with you and share with you where they're at in their emotions or their feelings or their thoughts, to just listen. And while we as adults also have our own choices to make, I just think that listening is very key. And although she's not here at the moment to be able to really share her thoughts, my daughter would tell you that she wrote me a very long letter one time not too long ago and really hashed out how she felt about a lot of things. And she was really frustrated with me. And I sat down with her and listened to her read this entire letter, of which was very hurtful for me as a mom, because I've invested all of these things and was a little surprised at some of the things she was so frustrated with me about. But in retrospect, at the end of that conversation and the end of her reading that letter, while I'm crying, I looked at her and said, now what are we going to do about it to move forward? And she thought for a minute, and then she said, I guess forgive each other. And I said, yep, and I can do that if you can do that. And she said, yes, she could do that. And we've never spoken about that again. And our relationship significantly improved after that. So I do think that your advice of forgiveness earlier in this conversation is key. But thank you, Zeb, for being transparent. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I'm hoping that maybe this will help some other adult child of divorced parents, or even parents who find themselves going through a divorce. And again, every situation is different. There's lots of emotions involved. But if you can, just do your best to think about where your kids are at in that process and consider what their emotions are. And some things are just going to happen, but at the same time, where we can listen to our children more and be able to adapt and be reflective and reflexive of their needs. All right. Well, I appreciate you chatting with me on air.
You're welcome.
All right. Love you.
Love you too.
Until next time. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Breaking Up with Naive. It's not a heartbreak, it's a rebrand.